Hey everyone, it's Synth Designer back again with another video. Today we're going to be talking about 90s house bass. In the intro you heard three distinct bass sounds. We have the organ bass from Robin S. and Show Me Love. We have the kind of squelch bass that you would hear in Wigfield's Saturday Night. And then we have the FM bass from Rhythm is a Dancer by Snap. These are three unique and distinct 90s bass sounds, and I created them all in Serum, and I'm going to show you how to make them coming up. Before we start, I just wanted to say if you're new here, check out my other videos, including my 80s bass video. I go through three distinct 80s basses on Serum as well. And if you like these videos, please consider subscribing. It really helps me out. And comment below if you want to see any types of videos at all. I'm glad to do anything on sound design. Now, why don't we start with the famous organ bass from Show Me Love by Robin S. So the bass sounds a little bit like this. So it's a really, really distinct organ sound. More recently, you may have heard it on one of Beyonce's tracks, but this is a super well-known bass sound from the 90s. So why don't we just take a look and see how this preset is formed. Now, anything with an organ requires a sine wave, and oftentimes you'll use a square because they kind of complement each other. The square is a little bit more raspy, I guess, and the sine provides that super deep sound, right? In this preset, it's exemplified perfectly because you have the depth of the sine wave and the upper harmonics of the square wave here. So let's just take a look, and you'll notice that the octave is 2 octaves down on the sine wave. So why don't we just solo that? And that really is just to provide all the sub bass frequencies. And the other important part here is not only is the square 2 octaves up from that, but it's also 7 semitones, which provides that distinct fifth element to it, right? By that I mean it's a perfect fifth above the root note. And then together. So it just has that great kind of unique quality to it. And it's backed up by this noise oscillator, actually. So it's easier to hear with just the sine wave. And then by itself. And the noise is meant to just give that kind of transient to it, that little pop to it. But it isn't meant to be kind of really, really in the forefront. But without it, you really notice it's missing. The great thing about this particular preset is that you can create it basically on any synth. I mean, it couldn't be any simpler than a sine and a square, right? And there's really not many other effects to it, but let's just take a look at the envelopes and see how they work. So envelope 1 has kind of a pretty quick attack, medium decay, and a longer sustain, and with a kind of medium release here. It's really not meant to be too short or too long. It's kind of has to drag out a little bit. So you could hold it and you can see it can go on forever basically, but it's not used really that way in the 90s. Like you wouldn't hear this as a sustained bass very often. It's really got that pop to it, and that's because of envelope 2. Envelope 2 is really what opens it up and it gives it that unique kind of bounce to it. As you can see, it's attached to the filter here, and without it, why don't we bypass and see how that would work? Obviously, there's barely any noise here, and it's so low. It's not quite the same effect as if we were to open it up and close it, right? That's kind of what gives a lot of its bounce to it. Finally, envelope 3, we have the noise oscillator being opened up and closed. That's on a very quick decay here, right? Why don't we bypass that and see what happens? Really too much sustained noise, and that's because the noise oscillator would be affected by the amp envelope, which is envelope 1 by default in Serum. So we don't want it to be so loud all the time. And that's why we have envelope 3 here and then back on. It's really meant to just provide that transience at the beginning and to close it off quickly. In the effects section, we have some compression going on, but that's it. Like, you don't need reverb and delay and all that because it's not meant to be a big kind of roomy sound. It's really meant to be kind of straight up the middle. And that's also because we have only one unison or one voice of unison on each of these, right? So it's really kind of straight up the middle, direct sound, and it's really going to be up front because of that sine wave. And even though there's a square, it's really meant to be a kind of direct upfront sound, and that's what makes it so kind of distinct. And oftentimes when it's used, it's very much at the forefront of the songs. Now let's move on to Wigfield's Lately bass here. Now the Lately bass was actually a preset from the Yamaha TX81Z, and it just goes to show you can use presets. If Wigfield can produce a huge hit with just a preset, then don't be afraid to use presets in your music as well. So let's talk about what makes this sound kind of interesting and unique. Now the big thing is this uses FM synthesis. Without going too much into detail about what FM synthesis is, it's about kind of modulating one sound with another, right? We have one oscillator modulating the other, and depending on the shape of the one, it will change how it modulates the other, right? So technically, Serum is not great for FM synthesis, but that doesn't mean it can't work really well in certain situations. And in this particular situation, I think it captures it pretty well. Why don't we hear the sound? Just that really great kind of a little bit squelchy, but not too squelchy. If you remember, if you saw my 80s video, we had a super squelchy sound, and that often comes from the resonance. So if I were to up the resonance here, now let's just play it in context. Now, how can you not love that sound? I mean, it was a kind of a cheesy song at the time. I remember when it came out, but it was fun and it's super distinct. So why don't we get into how we create it? Again, because this is the 90s, it doesn't use complicated wavetables. We just have a saw and a sine. And as you see, one is just 1 octave down and the other is 2 octave down. And once again, I have them both on just one single voice of unison, and then a little bit of fine detuning here on each of them to get a little bit of width to it. Now, what provides the pop to it? As you can see, envelope 1 is basically just fully sustained, fully decay. It's meant to just be completely open. But envelope 2 is what gives us that pop, right? Much like the organ bass that we just saw, this provides a quick kind of opening closing to the cutoff, right? And as you can see, it's a very kind of quick decay and no sustained sound, so it's going to open and close very quickly. But the important thing here is we have the FM synthesis going here. And as you can see, the level on the sine wave is actually completely down. So there's no sound at all. All the sound here is basically from this saw wave. But that's because it's being modulated here by the sine wave. So what does that mean? So let's just say if we were to turn this completely down, it loses a little bit of that kind of FM sound, and then we turn it up. Let's just hear how it sounds all the way up. It's not the same without it, right? So let's just turn it back relatively to where it was before. And that's really about shaping that sound here in Serum. And the thing is, I can't really show you because it doesn't have a great graphic to the FM here on Serum, but you can hear it very clearly, right? Why don't we play it and then in context change around this FM synthesis? That to me sounds really close to the original recording, right? And again, here we have a compressor, and this time it's actually a multi-band compressor that I turned on. It's a big difference here without it and with it. So why don't we play it with the compressor here, without. Really deep. You kind of need that compression here, especially the multi-band, to give you that kind of higher frequency sound. Otherwise, it sounds really, really kind of muddy, and that's not what we want here. And you don't need to use the Serum compressor here. You can create this and use a third-party compressor. Something like OTT would work really well as well. Or whatever native compressor you have on your DAW. Now, I don't want to get too much into the compression here, but it is important to have multi-band compression going and to deliver that unique sound. Let's just hear it in context, maybe. So it'll be about kind of dialing in where you want that sound to fit. I think it sounds good like that. And so that just goes to show if you have a synthesizer that can do some basic FM synthesis, this is a great way to go here. Serum is not the perfect synthesizer for this, but it goes to show you can create it here on Serum. And then lastly, we have the famous Rhythm is a Dancer bass, and this is heavily reliant on FM synthesis. So again, it's not going to be perfect here because Serum has its limitations, but I think we get a decent sound here. And again, this is going to be very similar to my 80s FM bass that I did in my previous video, but it is, distinctly 90s once you hear it. And here I'll show you, we have 3 different wavetables. We have the square on the sub, then the saw, and the sine wave. And this time, even though I'm using FM synthesis, I do have the level of the sine wave up still, because I want to have that backing kind of sine wave sound to it as well. The other thing you'll notice here is the resonance is up a little bit more. So why don't we hear it again and then get into it. So what do we have here? Across the board, I have all the wavetables 2 octaves down, and that's really to create kind of that depth to it, that deep sub sound, but with each wavetable kind of giving it a unique sound, right? I do have the filter on, and as you can guess, I have envelope 2 opening and closing again, and that's because we want that serious pop to it, right? And then I have the drive and the fat way up. That's because I really want it to be kind of that overdriven sound here. And the resonance does provide quite a bit of a difference. And that's really kind of giving it that unique vibe to it as well. Now, the other thing is I have a sine shaper here on the distortion, and that makes a big difference as well. Why don't we A/B it and see the difference? I find that the sine shaper is a great distortion option in Serum. I don't think the others quite give the right sound. And as you can see, the drive is way down here, and it's not even all the way up in the mix, yet it makes quite a difference. And that's just another great way of kind of shaping the sound to it. Now, I can't get into the actual details and mathematics of how a sine shaper works, but it's a very distinct kind of distortion, and it is a great option for kind of that 90s bass sound that you hear. And then I have just the EQ here kind of taking out some of the bottom and then getting some of the top end kind of boosted. So that's it. The 90s just had a lot of great bass sounds, especially in dance music. From the early to mid 90s, you had just some very recognizable bass sounds. And I used 3 songs here for the examples, but you'll find these basses all over the place in 90s dance music. Remember, one of the key elements of them is FM synthesis, but also it uses a lot of basic wavetables. You won't see crazy wavetables, and that's a lot to do with the fact that they use hardware, right? And hardware didn't have a lot of functions for crazy wavetables like we do today, especially not the digital ones. They had kind of a limitation of what you can do. So if you have a synthesizer that's capable of FM synthesis, you'll be able to create a lot of cool sounds. But even the basic kind of FM synthesis that you'll see in Serum can also do a pretty darn good job of creating these sounds. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.